The fluorescent lights in courtroom 14B had a flicker that the building manager had promised to fix for 3 years. Nobody had fixed it. It buzzed and dimmed in the corner above the gallery benches, and on a Tuesday morning in October, that small persistent failure was the most honest thing in the room. Judge Harold Fenwick had already ruled on 4 cases by 10 o'clock. He was efficient. Colleagues said so, had said so for years, in the way that becomes its own kind of truth the longer it goes unchallenged. He sat behind the elevated bench with the posture of a man who had stopped being surprised by anything that walked through his courtroom doors, and he read the next file the way a man reads a menu at a restaurant he's been to 100 times. When the bailiff called docket 2024 CV 4417, Morrison v City Planning Commission, Fenwick didn't look up. He gestured toward the plaintiff's table. The man who stood was large, 6'4", broad across the shoulders, wearing a charcoal suit that had been pressed carefully but hadn't cost what suits in this courthouse usually cost. He moved with a deliberate, measured pace, the kind you learn when you are a big man and you've spent enough years in the world to understand that a big man moving quickly reads as threat before it reads as anything else. So he moved slowly, always slowly. He had made that choice years ago and never once reconsidered it. His name was Marcus Morrison. He placed both hands flat on the plaintiff's table. Still. Completely still. "Your Honour," he said, "I'm here on behalf of the Morrison Youth Foundation regarding the denial of our construction variance. The Commission's—" "Mr. Morrison." Fenwick had finally looked up. A half-second pause. Not a hesitation, an assessment. "I've reviewed the petition. The Commission's denial falls within standard regulatory parameters. I don't see sufficient cause to proceed to a full hearing." Marcus didn't move. "Your Honour, I have documentation showing the Commission applied different structural standards to comparable properties in the same district over the past. The Commission has broad discretionary authority in these matters. With respect, Your Honour, when that discretion is applied inconsistently based on—" "Mr. Morrison." Fenwick set down his pen. His voice was patient in the way that signals the end of patience. "I appreciate your advocacy on behalf of your organisation, but this court's calendar is full, and I see nothing in this filing that rises to the level requiring judicial intervention. Motion to dismiss is granted." The gavel came down. Fast. Practiced. So many times it no longer sounded like a decision. It sounded like punctuation. In the back row of the gallery, a small woman in a charcoal blazer ran her right thumbnail slowly along the edge of the legal pad in her lap. It was a small motion, almost imperceptible, the kind of thing a person does without knowing they do it, the kind of thing that means something only to the people who have learned what it precedes. Nobody in that room was watching her. That was their first mistake. If this is the kind of story you need right now, subscribe. There's more coming. Marcus stood at the table for a moment after the gavel fell. He didn't sit. He didn't speak. He looked at Fenwick with an expression that was neutral in the way that only a specific kind of discipline produces. Not wounded, not angry, not surprised, present, as if he were cataloguing something, as if this moment were being filed alongside many others in a system no one else could access, for a purpose that hadn't yet arrived. Then he gathered his papers, slowly. The 2 small parallel scars on his right knuckles caught the fluorescent flicker as he closed the folder. He had been awake since 5 that morning. He was always awake at 5. 16 years of that, the kind of rhythm that doesn't leave when the uniform does, that follows you into civilian life and reorganizes it before you realize what's happened. He'd stopped resisting it years ago. The early mornings were his. His apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building he didn't own, in a neighbourhood the city's real estate listings had recently started describing as emerging. He'd moved here a decade ago because the rent was honest and the people were real, and because someone, he had decided, needed to stay when everyone else was calculating the exits. He made coffee without measuring. He knew the amount by feel, by the sound of the water, by something that had moved from habit into instinct so long ago the distinction didn't matter anymore. He stood at the window while it brewed and watched the street below. The corner bodega, the school bus at 6:40, Mrs. Reyes in her blue housecoat walking her terrier regardless of season, regardless of cold. He noticed these things. He had always noticed. It wasn't anxiety. It was something that had been trained into him in places he no longer discussed. Something that had kept him and the men around him alive more than once in conditions he did not describe at dinner parties or foundation galas or anywhere else people asked him politely about his service. The world, for Marcus, was always being read, assessed, filed. The Morrison Youth Foundation had 12 full-time employees. 347 kids came through its doors every week for tutoring, counselling and job training. On Wednesday evenings there was a cooking class that Marcus had started himself, after a 14-year-old named Deshawn had told him without embarrassment that he didn't know how to make anything that didn't come from a package. Marcus had learnt to cook in the field with almost nothing, in circumstances that bore no resemblance to a kitchen. He'd passed it on as best he could. The foundation's lease was ending in 4 months. They had found a building, a former warehouse 3 blocks east, solid bones, high ceilings, natural light. And Marcus had spent 8 months on the application. Architects, engineers, community impact assessments, every form filed correctly, every standard met and documented, every box checked twice. He had been meticulous because he had learned through long experience that meticulous was the only armour that reliably held. The denial had arrived on a Thursday morning. Structural concerns, the letter said. He'd read it 3 times, set it on the counter, made another cup of coffee. Then he'd looked up the structural concerns, compared them to 3 comparable properties approved in the preceding 18 months, documented the discrepancy in a 17-page filing, and registered for a court date. He hadn't told his staff. He hadn't wanted them to hope for something he couldn't promise. He'd told one person, a veteran who sat on his foundation's board, a man who had also spent time in rooms where promises were made and then quietly unmade. And that man had looked at him for a long moment and said, "Go." So he'd gone. The arson to ceilings Amelis. So he'd gone, across the city. At roughly the same hour Marcus had been standing at his window watching Mrs. Reyes and her terrier, Claire Ashworth, had been in a hotel elevator, debating breakfast. She'd decided against it before she finished asking the question. She ate a granola bar from her bag on the way down, and was reviewing notes from the prior day's observation session by the time the lobby doors opened. She was 41, 5'2" on a good day, a phrase she used with a dryness that made people laugh before they understood she wasn't softening it. She moved through the world with the particular efficiency of someone who had stopped explaining herself to rooms a long time ago, and had simply gotten very good at what she did instead. She had practiced law for 16 years, 8 before that as a federal prosecutor in the Southern District, where she had tried 42 cases and won 39 of them, a record that would have been celebrated loudly by other people in other circumstances. She had a clerkship before that, and a circuit judge who told her on her final day that she was the sharpest legal mind he'd encountered in 30 years on the bench. She had thanked him sincerely, taken the bus home, made herself pasta, and been in bed by 9:30. She did not tell that story. She did not tell most of her stories. They were in the record. The record was sufficient. She was in the city on behalf of the State Judicial Conduct Commission, of which she had been chair for 3 years. The commission reviewed complaints against sitting judges, patterns of bias, procedural irregularity, conduct unbecoming the bench. It was quiet work, serious work, the kind of work that happened in back rows and observation and written reports rather than argument and verdict. Judge Harold Fenwick had 12 open complaints filed against him over the preceding 4 years. She had read every one. Finuere, Andy Donis Oro. Finiwer 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 Andy Donis Oro. She had a legal pad, a pen, and the habit she had carried since her first year of law school without ever analysing it or trying to stop it. Before she stood, before she spoke, before she made any formal move she intended to matter, she ran her right thumbnail slowly along the edge of whatever paper was in her hands. A small motion, private, almost nothing, but the people who knew her, the ones who had been on the opposite side of a courtroom from her more than once, recognized it. They knew what came next. She was running it now, watching Fenwick work from the back row. Harold Fenwick had been on the bench for 19 years. Before that, 14 years in civil litigation, where he had been, by most accounts, in most rooms where accounts were given, one of the more formidable proceduralists in the circuit. Meticulous, prepared, a believer in the architecture of law, with the kind of faith that approached the devotional, its structures, its hierarchies, its rules. He had studied them, he had served them, he continued to believe, with complete sincerity, that he was their faithful custodian. He was not a cruel man. This was essential to understand. He went home to a house in a quiet neighbourhood, and fed his cat and read history books, and called his daughter every Thursday. He had coached Little League for 6 years before his calendar made it impossible. He donated to 3 charities, reliably. He did not return home in the evenings feeling satisfied by the harder moments of his courtroom. He returned home tired and certain that the system, properly applied, produced correct outcomes. What he had developed over 19 years was a fluency, a pattern recognition so practiced it had become invisible to him. He could read a case before the first argument was made. He called it experience. It felt like experience. It had the texture and weight of experience. What it had also become, gradually, without announcement, without any single moment he could have identified as the turning, was the kind of efficiency that no longer questioned itself, that had stopped, somewhere along the way, distinguishing between what it had always seen and what was actually in front of it. When Marcus Morrison walked to the plaintiff's table, Fenwick had looked up and processed. Large man, self-represented, community organisation, permit dispute. He had seen it before. He believed he knew how it resolved. He had not looked at the back row. The Saint Wonenstein. The Saint Wonenstein. He had not looked at the back row. He almost never looked at the back row. Marcus was still standing at the plaintiff's table, dismissed folder in hand, when the voice reached him from the gallery. You have grounds for an interlocutory appeal. He turned. The woman moving toward him from the gallery was small enough that his brain performed the automatic recalibration, that fraction of a second adjustment that happens when the room doesn't match the sound, when the presence in the air doesn't match the size in the frame. She wore a charcoal blazer over a white shirt, carried a legal pad under one arm, and was looking at him with an expression that contained neither pity nor condescension. Just assessment. Clean and direct, the way a navigator reads coordinates. I was sitting in the back, she said. I heard the filing. I noticed you, he said. Fi's bat. Fi's unthawed by is the vera. Fi's unthawed, fi's unthawed, fi's on the ra. 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 Most people received that with some version of surprise. She didn't. She had already moved on. An engineer's report that directly contradicts the Commission's stated structural basis. That isn't regulatory discretion. That's pretextual. Under state administrative code, that gives you grounds for appeal. She stopped at the railing. Do you have the full report? I have everything with me. Weiss I see far tanis tai, auti fars, viti hauti fars, utas shai, Your utortical seed. May I see it? See it and tosses enough for it than me dare. May I see it? He set the folder on the railing. She opened it without ceremony. The thumbnail moved along the edge of the first page, small, private, barely visible. And then she was reading, and the room was quiet around her reading, in a way that felt different from the quiet of a few minutes before. The clerk at the far desk glanced over. An attorney who had been collecting his things near the door had paused in collecting them. Your engineer, she said without looking up. Franklin Osei. Yes. Of via Sade, and via Sade. We can find vimful morse o ducid and vimful bruises via Sade, via Sade, via Sade. Via Sade, 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 via Sade. Credentials are on page 4. The af is daar ezenvaar. Far is the law. Farf no waste to da. Far sees ezenvaar. Far sees no waste far seized ardom me. Far sees ezenvaar. Far sees ardom me. Page 4. At a seat arpen, no is mosu. One is wiz ar spon seed sees wana. One is war and one is war. For the sea and one is war is arped knows war. For the seat are ekintamus melees almrude mos war. She turned to it. Read it. The thumbnail moved again along the edge. Give me a moment, she said. Verhalfem vijf tijd. Onnoben puur life to law. Verhalfem vijf tain mossen wij. Give me a moment, she said. She took the folder to the clerk's desk. Marcus watched her from the railing, his hands at his sides, still in the particular way that was never about passivity and had always been about something else, a trained economy of motion, a discipline that had been learned in conditions he didn't discuss. She said something to the clerk, placed something on the desk, a small card, cream-coloured, square. The clerk read it, then read it again, then reached for the phone. The attorney near the door had stopped moving entirely. A woman in the gallery who had been reading her phone was no longer reading it. The court reporter's hands were still above her machine. Fenwick was returning to the bench for the next case when the clerk intercepted him. A note passed quietly, a whispered exchange at the margin of the formal record. Fenwick read it. His posture didn't shift. 19 years of composure held that much. But the colour at the edges of his face did something that composure couldn't entirely contain. He read it again. He looked up. The wade is Nike pa. The wade iwad zar ezing war. The wade zar ezar is eyes. Is Nike pa ezar. The wazar is Nike pa. Harther the fine. Claire Ashworth was standing at the bar. She had not announced herself. She had not raised her voice. She had simply placed her commission card on the clerk's desk and allowed the room to do the rest. Miss Ashworth, Fenwick began, I was observing today's proceedings on behalf of the State Judicial Conduct Commission. Her voice was the same volume it had been when she'd spoken to Marcus at the railing. It didn't need to be louder. I'd like to note for the record that the Morrison filing contains a structural assessment by Dr. Franklin Osei, formerly of the Army Corps of Engineers, currently holding a named chair at the State College of Engineering, whose findings directly contradict the Commission's stated basis for denial. One beat of silence, the thumbnail had gone still. I'll be including today's proceeding in my report to the Commission. Nobody in the room moved. Dasam they, then sendu over. Then a sendu over. Nobody in the room moved. Fenwick's jaw adjusted. Barely. The matter has been dismissed. It has, Claire said. No aggression, no theatre. You may want to reconsider. Marcus was at the plaintiff's table, looking at Fenwick. Not with anger, with that reading expression, cataloguing, filing, the same face he'd worn when the gavel first came down. And Fenwick, for the first time in this proceeding, was looking back at Marcus in a way that was different from before. Slower, more careful, as if something had shifted in the lens and the image he'd formed at first glance was no longer reliable. The attorney near the door, who had been still for several minutes now, said something quiet to the person beside him. A name. The clerk at the desk turned, and then the court reporter, without lifting her eyes from her machine, said, "His foundation is the non-profit arm. The development company built the Meridian complex and the Harlow Bridge renovation." Her fingers moved to the next key. He served, Special Forces, 2 tours. A pause. Medal of Honor, 2009. The room absorbed this without sound. The wrote without sound. Ifanaim Avromosmans absorbed this without sound. Marcus said nothing. He did not look at the court reporter. He did not look vindicated. He looked exactly as he had when he'd walked through the courtroom doors that morning. Present, composed, reading the room with the absolute stillness of a man for whom the room's opinion had long since stopped being the measure of anything. Marcus looked at Claire. Fenesta Caesar compar. Venornis Womplo. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at Fenwick, who had gone the colour of old paper, who was speaking in low tones to his clerk, who had the expression of a man understanding, in stages, not all at once, that he had made 2 significant errors in the same morning. 2 people he had not thought to read. 2 rooms within the room he had not thought to look at. The errors didn't announce themselves dramatically. They arrived quietly, one after the other. That was, somehow, worse. Claire picked up her legal pad from the plaintiff's table. She ran the thumbnail along the edge one final time. A closing motion, small and complete. And then she was done. She did not look triumphant. She looked exactly as she had when she'd walked into the room. Composed, purposeful, unhurried. As if the outcome had been, from the moment she'd read the file at the railing, the only outcome she had considered. Neither of them said anything. Not to each other. Not to the room. There was nothing in that moment that the room needed from them. The hallway outside courtroom 14B was long and marble-floored, and carried sound the way courthouses are designed to carry it, with weight, with authority, with the acoustic implication that what happens here matters. Claire's footsteps didn't carry. They never had. She had stopped waiting for that particular acknowledgement a long time ago. She was at the elevator when Marcus came through the doors behind her. He stopped a few feet away, at the precise distance of someone who understood intuitively where presence ends and intrusion begins. He had always understood that. The elevator button was already lit. Neither of them pressed it again. "Thank you," he said. 2 words. He meant them without inflation. Van Hoordorf night Conmarse. She looked up at him. The distance between them was what it was, a fact of the world neither of them had any particular feeling about, and said, "You had the case." He wasn't going to hear it. The settle Ardmofear. This armour thee sound. With ward with pine as a bar. Whiffle wasn't going to hear it. No. She shifted the legal pad under her arm. He wasn't. The elevator arrived. They stepped in. She pressed L. He pressed L. They stood in the silence that belongs to people who have been through something together without having planned to, who understand without discussing it that some things don't need to be processed aloud to be real. At the second floor, she said, "Your foundation. The kids." "The kids, 347, he said. "This week?" She nodded once. Not with surprise. With the specific expression of someone whose already formed assumption has been confirmed by the number itself. The lobby opened around them. They crossed the marble atrium into the light coming through the courthouse's tall front windows, and at the place where the corridor divided, left toward the main exit, right toward the parking structure, they paused. He looked toward the doors. She looked the same direction. "People keep thinking they know what they're looking at," he said. I said a dile aneas par said a duties par said dile anu. "People keep thinking they know what they're looking at," he said. She was quiet for a moment. 1 beat. 2. Vftasik. "And then they find out," she said. "Ahies, ahies, 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 ahies. She went left. He went right. With undersigned mat, now soft as it he hand road. He went left, he went right, and what stayed? Long after the commission report was filed, and the dismissal was overturned on appeal, and the permit finally came through on a cold afternoon in February, and the foundation broke ground on a Thursday in March, with 347 kids watching, what stayed was not the gavel, and not the reversal, and not the expression on Fenwick's face as the room rearranged itself around the two people he hadn't thought to see. It was the two of them. A woman the world kept underestimating, a man the world kept misreading. Standing in a marble hallway in the particular quiet of people who have spent their whole lives becoming exactly who they are, not despite everything, but through it. One room at a time, one moment at a time, one decision to show up and do the right thing, for no reason except that it was right. That is all it had been. And it had been enough. Fear, fear paiga, fear. The most dangerous person in any room is never the one behind the bench, or the one holding the gavel. It is the one they forgot to watch, the one in the back row, who had already read the file, who had already decided, who needed nothing from the room except the one thing the room had not yet thought to give, the chance to be exactly who they were. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe. There are more stories like this one waiting.